Okay, cool. Hey everyone. If you don't already know, my name is Max. Today I'm going to talk about my daily happiness tracking practice. A couple of things before we start. First of all, I'm looking at my slides. I cannot see you, so if something goes wrong, please speak up. I'm still getting used to presenting by just looking at my screen and not seeing your lovely faces. And then I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions and maybe experiences with this kind of thing as well. But please save your questions until the end, unless something goes terribly wrong, and then definitely please speak up. So for the last 3 years, at the end of every day, I've jotted down some notes on what I've done that day, and I rated my day out of 10. So you might be wondering, well, that's cool. That's a lot of like you data, but what does that have to do with me? Well, I'm looking forward to sharing what I've learned and what worked and what didn't, so that even if you don't take up this kind of practice yourself, maybe some of these lessons can help you reflect on your own life. And if nothing else, it might just be kind of a good story. So how did this come about? My birthday is at the very end of the year. It's on December 28th. And so I have a tradition between December 28th and New Year's of reflecting on how the year has gone, what I want to accomplish by the start of next year, and also by my next birthday. And so about 3 years ago, I was working at a job that was stressful and didn't make me very happy. I felt overcommitted to a ton of projects that I wasn't finishing. I just wasn't feeling too great in life. So sitting down and reflecting, I figured a good theme for my next year, which I think was 2017, would be to simplify and cut a lot of these projects that I wasn't that involved in, and try to commit to the 3 things that I thought would make me happy, which were exercising, writing code, and playing music and writing music. And so the way I figured I would enforce this is, yeah, also lots of other people have done this kind of thing. So I'm sure I stumbled on that at some point. But I figured I would try this for a year. And the way I would enforce it is just put together a little daily form that I would have sent to me at the end of the day, where I jot a couple of sentences about what I did that day, note whether I actually accomplished these 3 things that I was trying to get done, whether I went to work. And then almost as an afterthought, I figured, hey, why don't I rate my day 1 through 10, just to kind of get a sense for how it went. And it went so well that at the end of the year, I figured, hey, why don't I do this for another year? And at the end of that year, I was so committed to the practice that it is now a permanent thing in my life. So if I had to summarize my life in a single metric, this is it. On average, my days are a 7 out of 10. And what's really cool is when I break this down by year, I can clearly see that my life is getting better. And that's pretty cool. So here, for example, are my last 3 months worth of weekly data. And here's almost 3.5 years of data with ratings by month. So when I look at a data set like this, I can identify some pretty interesting moments in my life. For example, when I started, I was working at a job that made me really stressed and unhappy. But I would also sometimes travel, and those months would always be better. This second blip here in June 2018 was when I came out to Colorado for the 2nd or 3rd time and decided I wanted to live there. However, in between, I was feeling anxious and unsure about where my life was going. I was 5 years out of college. I had a string of jobs in tech that didn't really add up to a career. And I was doing a lot of self-reflection and not feeling so great about where my life was going. However, in the middle of 2018, I lucked into a development apprenticeship with the New York City Mayor's office, where for the first time in my life, I was writing code as a job. And shortly thereafter, I joined a community of programmers that helped me find my way into the industry. And from there on, my life continued to get better as I became a developer. And you could see that this year has been pretty great so far. So that's a lot of data. And by looking at it with 3.5 years worth of data, I can see some cool patterns and trends. So for example, I know exactly what I did on this day for the last 3 years. A year ago, for example, I was interviewing for jobs and I had an interview with a company that is not Bonusly. Too bad. I also had a clear answer to my question of how often was I accomplishing these things that I was setting out to accomplish. And this nudged me to do more of them. So for example, halfway through 2017, about 6 months into my practice, I sat down and I looked at how often I was exercising and writing code and writing music, and it was a lot less than I wanted to be. And now I have the data to prove it. So that nudged me to do these things more. And as you can see, on average, through the years, I've been exercising more and writing more code, and writing more music. So in that way, I hit the goal that I was, that encouraged me to start this practice to begin with. It also gave me a snapshot on how my days are going on average. So as you can see, a bulk of my days, about 90% are a 6 or a 7 or an 8, and about 5% are stellar days that are a 9 or a 10. And about 6% are not so good. Thankfully, I have not had any ones so far, and this is a totally subjective thing, but for a while I reserved 1s and 10s for sort of the highest of highs or the lowest of lows, the kinds of like wonderful and tragic days that change the course of your life, that stay with you. And over time, I've sort of accepted that I have days in my life that are truly wonderful, but thankfully, I haven't had any yet that are truly terrible. So speaking of highs and lows, cool outcome of tracking daily is that I can look back at the last 3 years and know exactly what the best and worst days of my life are. For example, these are the worst. A couple of them have to do with a past job. And then another is making the decision to leave my life in New York behind and move to Colorado. But I can also see my best days, 3 of which happened in Colorado 2 years ago when I decided to move here after having an amazing time. And then others being outdoors and exploring with friends and spending time with people that I love. So collecting this data and making sense of it hasn't always been easy. And I'd love to share some of the challenges that I ran into and maybe hear your thoughts about them at the end of this presentation. Quite frankly, at the end of many days, I just don't feel like filling out the form, especially if it hasn't been a good day. It can feel kind of crappy to sit down and put it down on paper and say, today wasn't a good day. It was a 4 or a 5, and I really didn't get much done. It's a sense of accountability that doesn't always feel pleasant. And when I started, I would skip a lot of days and then go back and reluctantly fill them in with sort of a poor memory of what happened. But I will say that with time, it's gotten easier. And although I occasionally skip days now, I mostly report on my day at the end of every day, and I try to fill in gaps quickly. The data is by no means scientifically rigorous, right? Like, what is a 6 out of 10 for me? It's a deeply subjective thing. That number might mean something very different to someone else. So it's a very me specific data set. And more than that, if I don't know what a 6 out of 10 is a 6 out of 10 today the same as a 6 out of 10 last year? I don't know. Finally, and I think this is an interesting one, is on days where I wasn't doing so well, I still felt pressure to be grateful. So my hunch is that I would rate days that didn't go well higher than I actually felt. And I think you could look at this in a couple of ways. One is that it's not the most honest self-reflection. But another is that even on days when I didn't feel great, I still thought that, hey, it could be worse, and looked for reasons to be grateful. So I learned a ton doing this thing. Tons of patterns all over my life that I was not aware of. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, I answered the question of how often do I actually do these things and hit the goals that I've committed to? And this chart from earlier answers that question. Second of all, having a daily ritual where I am accountable to what I did that day nudged me to be more productive and actually pursue the goals that I've committed to. And also just be more mindful of where my days are going. So if I had a day where I kind of sat around and watched TV and felt lazy, and I would say to myself, oh, it's just today, I'll get back into it tomorrow, I could look at the last week's worth of data and say, actually, no, this is day 6 that I've just like watched Netflix the whole day and got nothing done. So that's been really helpful. And then finally, it's given me like actionable recipes for improving my day better. So if I have a day where like by the afternoon, things are not going well and I'm feeling crappy and I'm like, well, today is going to be a 4 or a 5, I can ask myself, how do I turn that 5 into a 6 or a 7? And by looking at the data, I know that on the days where I spend time with my friends or spend time in nature or exercise, end up being better. And I think we all have sort of a sense of understanding, but I have actual data that I can look at. And so rather than relying on motivation and saying, oh, maybe I should exercise and I'll feel better, I can look at data that says, if I exercise, I will decidedly feel better. I have many days that support that. So it's actually nudged me to have better days. And finally, it's just helped me gain a sense of acceptance. I think some days life can feel like a roller coaster and some days feel really crappy, and it can be easy to fall into kind of black and white thinking where you think this day is sort of how my life is. And I have data to look at that says some days are really crappy, but generally things get better. And some days I get nothing done, but it's not the end of the world because I get back into being productive. So a couple of you might be thinking, I want to try this. So I thought I'd end by talking about a couple of things that I learned about the practice and some tips that I have. First of all, figure out why you're doing this. I think starting a practice like this without a clear reason, which for me was to track whether I was hitting these 3 goals that I set out for myself, will just kind of lead you to get discouraged. And there are many days I just didn't really feel like doing it. So figure out why you want to pursue this thing. Second of all, make your data collection as simple as possible. I intentionally made my forms so short so that I had no excuse not to fill it out. It takes 30 seconds and I literally just jot down a sentence about what I did that day and click a couple of buttons. And finally, if you miss a couple of days or just have days that you are not proud of, don't get discouraged. A sort of realization I had on days where I really didn't feel like being accountable is the day already happened, right? So the choice I had is I could jot down what happened or continue to have these days where I had no idea what was happening over the long term. So don't get discouraged, just write it down and then at a later time, go back and reflect. And that's my presentation. Thanks, everyone.